what I said. I asked, who is a greater threat to Israel, Hamas or the current U.S. administration? And before you discount that statement as an overreaction or an exaggeration, you got to just hear what happened just this past week, right? Because so much is happening, right? It's easy that you could have possibly missed this. So for it feels like the 100th time, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. I feel like in my mind the word Blinken has become like a derogatory curse word. Like, oh, my stomach hurts, I have to Blinken. I don't know. It's just like I just can't stand him. I'm so repulsed by him. He made his way to Israel. I think it was actually his 4th trip since October 7th, but it felt like his 100th. And before his meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, there was this tremendous optimism by many in Israel that America has to stand with us and support us in our existential war against Hamas. People were still really optimistic about it. But after witnessing the press conference following that meeting, the faces of so many of the news anchors reporting on it were just downcast, were downtrodden. I really think that when history looks back at these difficult times for Israel, this press conference will be considered a turning point in the U.S.-Israel relationship. It'll be considered as the moment when the masks came off and it became clear to anyone with the courage to see it that America had turned its back on Israel like never before when Israel needed America most. Laman te'aminu v'tavinu, as Isaiah says. So we should understand. I was actually thinking of playing the entire press conference, but it was 28 minutes long, and I didn't have the time to pull out the highlights that I wanted to. So I just have the quotes that I'm going to share with you, a few of them. But the press conference started with Blinken declaring some empty, stupid platitudes about caring about Israel. And even within those empty platitudes, he managed to compare the suffering of the hostages and their families to the suffering of the jihadi Gazans who have proven 1,000 different ways that they are Hamas, that they supported Hamas, they cheered Hamas, they even participated, if they could, in the October 7th Hamas massacre. This is known. But to Anthony Blinken, the suffering of Hamas and their supporters and their sympathizers and their participants is the same as the suffering of the hostages. It's just such moral blindness and bankruptcy. But anyways, forget all the fluff, right? When it came to the policies that America was not recommending, but was demanding of Israel, it became clear that America was insisting that Israel do nothing short of lose this war for our very survival. There's really no other way to see it. To start with, he demanded that Israel continue to provide food and fuel and supplies to UNRWA. The United Nations Relief Works, or what's it, UNRWA? Whatever. It's the United Nations in Gaza, okay? Totally ignoring the overwhelming torrents of unrefuted, undeniable facts, meaning there's no one that's even refuting this. There's no one that's trying to disprove it. It's just so obvious and clear that the UNRWA is Hamas. Many of them card-carrying members of UNRWA were terrorists that were caught as terrorists. It was proven that an UNRWA doctor tortured and starved hostages in his own home. A hostage in his own home. UNRWA is Hamas and everybody knows it. But none of that mattered. According to the United States, they needed to have an UNRWA. And they said that Israel needs to funnel untold tons of food and fuel and supplies to UNRWA as our hostages, may Hashem protect them, are starved and raped by the very people we're providing this life-saving aid to literally as we speak. And that was America's demand. We need to give UNRWA food and fuel and supplies. Who gives their mortal enemy that just holocausted them fuel and supplies? And as if that demand that we feed and supply Hamas wasn't enough, that we strengthen our mortal enemy, as if that wasn't enough, he went on to demand that there should be zero civilian casualties, despite the fact that he recognized that Israel is, quote, facing an enemy that embeds itself among civilians, who hides in and fires from schools, from hospitals, makes this incredibly challenging. But the daily toll on civilians in Gaza, particularly on children, is just far too high. Yes, we know that the terrorists that raped, tortured, and murdered your fellow Jews are hiding among civilians. Yes, we realize that, but too bad. They win. We're going to reward that behavior and say they're safe. You're not allowed to fight them. And if you do, you're fighting us. That means that those terrorists are safe and that you have to lose. Sorry, Israel, sorry. And then to seal the deal, he declared, the United States unequivocally rejects any proposals advocating for the resettlement of Palestinians outside of Gaza. Just take a second to just listen. The United States unequivocally rejects any proposals advocating for the resettlement of Palestinians outside of Gaza. You know, sometimes I watch, what's her name? The Speaker of the House makes statements. She's like, and I've clarified 1,000 times, and she makes another unclear, ambiguous statement. But when it comes to Israel, their statements are super clear. No, you know, he demanded that the Gazan Hamas sympathizing jihadists must not be allowed to leave Gaza. That's right. The United States makes it clear that these innocent refugees shouldn't be allowed to leave Gaza even if they want to. And then he went on to say that they should be allowed to go back to northern Gaza and resettle there as soon as possible. I cannot think of one conflict in the world in which refugees are being forbidden the right to flee and resettle elsewhere by those who claim to care for their... Are they doing that in Russia and the Ukraine? No, of course not. They're shipping them wherever they can possibly ship them. But no, not in Gaza. That's perhaps the most sick, twisted, and sinister of all the demands. Because why in the world would the U.S. insist that Israel allow these Nazi jihadists to massacre the Jewish people to stay, if not that they want Israel to be embroiled in this murderous nightmare indefinitely? So in the south,
Can I also just add one point, Ari?
Yes.
About northern Gaza? Last fellowship, I did an entire section about one of the most beautiful people that I've ever known. His name was Ephraim Jackman, and he was killed in northern Gaza. So northern Gaza is still a war zone. So like, let the Hamas go back to the war zone that they're still trying to like get under control. Like, it's so obvious that they are trying to not only embroil Israel in a conflict forever by not allowing the refugees to leave, but they want Israel to fall in battle and put stumbling blocks in front of us from winning the battle to begin with.
I mean, imagine that, God forbid, Bibi gives in and acquiesces to these demands. Imagine the parents of Ephraim Jackman. Imagine the parents of all the soldiers who have died so bravely and valiantly fighting for Israel, now just giving Gaza back to Hamas. Their children died for nothing, for nothing. Anyway, so in the South, our dear friend America is demanding that we strengthen our enemies by providing them with food and fuel, weaken ourselves by tying our hands behind our backs, and they ensure that the war will last as long as it takes for us to lose by refusing to allow our enemies to flee. You know, and for time's sake, I'm not going to go into all the details and what's happening in the north, but it's just as bad, if not worse, because the stakes are even higher. Because Hezbollah makes Hamas look like a bunch of jokers. And rather than taking measures to distance Hezbollah from Israel's border and allow hundreds of thousands of Jews living in the north to finally return home, no, America demands, not only do they not weaken Hezbollah at all, but it strengthens them by effectively demanding that Israel cede sovereign territory to the Hezbollah, not send the Jews back, because what they're saying is by keeping Hezbollah, they're not trying to decrease their weapons or their missiles or their troops, nothing at all, but rather they're strengthening Hezbollah in exchange for promises from Hezbollah that mean absolutely nothing. If you want to go into the details, go to JNS. JNS, by the way, a very good source of news, and read Carolyn Glick's article called "Victory is More Important Than U.S. Support." Victory is more important than U.S. support. She's the best, Carolyn Glick. Anyways, I'm not going to go too much more into this, but just to put salt into the open wound, to seal the deal, just in case there's any ambiguity left regarding America's intent, he went on to call for a Palestinian state. As I told the Prime Minister, every Arab partner that I met with on this trip said they're ready to support a lasting solution that ends the long-running cycle of violence and ensures Israel's security, blah, blah, blah. But they underscored that this can only come through a regional approach that includes a pathway to a Palestinian state. A Palestinian state. Gaza was the Palestinian state, and look what it looked like. And the Palestinian Authority, which America is insisting takes the mantle of leadership and gets this reward of their own state, is just as bad as Hamas. Up until October 7th, they killed more Jews than Hamas had. There's overwhelming videoed proof that they participated in the October 7th massacre. They pay, I think it's $30 million a month, subsidized by US taxes, of course, to the family of terrorists who successfully murdered Jews. Babies in their bed, the families of those terrorists are getting money every single month for their successful murder of Jews. That's the Palestinian Authority that the United States and Blinken wants to give a Palestinian state in the heartland of Israel along the coast to, I mean, the Biden administration insisting on having this Palestinian state would result in hundreds of October 7th. And everyone knows it. And then for good measure, he repeated this vicious blood libel about me and Jeremy and our fellow rabid settlers. He said, extremist settler violence carried out with impunity, settlement expansion, demolitions, evictions all make it harder, not easier for Israel to achieve lasting peace and security. It doesn't matter that there's been a total of zero settler violence, zero. You know, in the article, Carolyn Glick even quotes CNN anchor Jake Tapper, who quoted a member of the U.S. administration, that Netanyahu needs to decide between the explicit will of his electorate, right, the people of Israel who elected a right-wing government with people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. They would have to decide between his coalition and them or the friendship of the United States of America. Ignore your people, Israel, ignore your identity, ignore your very essence of who you are, and sell yourselves out for us, the friend of who. It's so crazy. What does that mean? If it isn't clear by now, our good friend America is demanding our prime minister rejects the will of the nation of Israel, the best interest, the very survival of the nation of Israel, in exchange for the friendship and support of America. That, my friends, is not the behavior of a friend. That is the behavior of an enemy. And it reminds me of a story of this girl that I remember this story. I didn't even know if I should share it with you, but it was just so exact that this girl convinced her boyfriend to commit suicide. Here, watch this.
This young woman responsible for her boyfriend's suicide, Michelle Carter, is accused of sending her boyfriend Conrad Roy a series of text messages urging him to take his own life. It's time, babe. You know that, Carter wrote. You gotta do it. You're ready. Roy responded, okay, I will. No more thinking. Yes, no more thinking. You need to just do it, she wrote back. Just park your car and sit there, and it will take like 20 minutes.
It'll take like 20 minutes. It's not a big deal. I couldn't help but to think of that when I think about the absolutely dysfunctionally sick and twisted relationship that has developed between America and Israel right now. That's what's going on here. From this press conference, it became clear that America is coming to the table with one very clear demand, that Israel commits suicide.